Somewhere beneath the streets you walk every day, beneath the office towers and the freeways and the quiet suburban homes, the earth is under strain. In a handful of American cities, the ground is not the solid, permanent thing it appears to be. It is a seam, a crack, a boundary where two enormous pieces of the planet's crust press against each other and slowly, silently, build up the pressure of a coming earthquake. These are the cities built directly on top of active fault lines, and the millions of people who live in them go about their lives with almost no awareness that a geological time bomb runs right beneath their feet. Most people imagine that a fault line is something far away, out in the wilderness, a distant crack in some remote desert. But the truth is far more unsettling. Some of the largest and most important cities in the United States were built directly astride active faults, in some cases with the fault running straight through the heart of downtown, beneath homes, schools, stadiums, and hospitals. These cities did not end up there by accident. Often the very features that made the land attractive, the bays, the valleys, the flat building ground at the foot of the mountains, exist because of the faults themselves. The same forces that make a place beautiful and buildable are the forces that make it dangerous. In this video, we are going to journey across America to 6 cities that sit directly on top of active fault lines. We will look at where the faults run, why each city is so dangerously exposed, and what could happen when the ground finally lets go. We will explore the science of why building on a fault is so perilous, and the strange history of how so many people came to live in such precarious places. Some of these cities you will expect to see on this list. Others may genuinely surprise you, because not all of America's fault line cities are on the West Coast. And one of them sits in a part of the country most people would never associate with earthquakes at all. Stay with me to the end, because understanding which cities are built on these hidden seams and why changes the way you see the ground beneath every one of them. Hashtag what it means to live on a fault before we visit the cities. We need to understand what a fault actually is and why building directly on top of one is so uniquely dangerous, because the risk is more specific and more frightening than most people realize. A fault is a fracture in the Earth's crust, a place where two great blocks of rock meet and move relative to each other. That movement is what causes earthquakes. The blocks are locked together by friction, held fast while the deep forces of the planet keep pushing them, and the strain builds and builds until the friction finally gives way and the rock lurches into a new position, releasing all that stored energy in a matter of seconds. That sudden release is the earthquake, and it can shake the ground violently for a great distance around. But here is the crucial point for a city built directly on a fault. There are actually 2 distinct dangers, and living right on top of the fault exposes you to both. The first is the shaking itself, the seismic waves that radiate outward from the rupture, which can damage or destroy buildings across a wide region. Any city near a major fault faces this. But the second danger is far more localized, and in its own way, more terrifying. It is surface rupture, the moment when the fault actually tears the ground apart at the surface, when the 2 sides of the fault physically slide past each other and split open the land above. Anything built directly across the fault line, a house, a road, a pipeline, a school, can be ripped in two as the ground beneath it moves in opposite directions. This is why building directly on a fault is a special kind of danger. It is not just that these cities will shake when the earthquake comes. It is that the very ground can crack open and shift beneath the structures on top of it, tearing apart anything unlucky enough to straddle the line. And there is a third, insidious danger too. In many of these places, the fault runs through areas of soft, water-saturated soil, which can behave catastrophically in an earthquake, losing its strength and turning almost liquid, causing buildings to sink, tilt, and topple. So when we talk about cities built on fault lines, we are talking about places exposed to the full spectrum of earthquake hazard, in the most direct and unforgiving way possible. Now let us meet them. Hashtag number 6. Memphis and the hidden danger in the heartland. We begin with the city that will surprise most people, because it is nowhere near the West Coast, nowhere near the places Americans normally associate with earthquakes. It is Memphis, Tennessee, sitting in the heart of the American South, along the great Mississippi River. And yet Memphis lies within reach of one of the most dangerous seismic zones in the entire country, a deep and troubled region of the Earth's crust that has produced some of the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of the continent. This seismic zone, buried beneath the surface of the central United States, is a place where the crust is under strain far from any ocean or obvious mountain range. Long ago, this region unleashed a series of truly enormous earthquakes, so powerful that they were felt across vast distances, rang church bells hundreds of miles away, and, according to the accounts of the time, temporarily changed the course of the mighty river itself. That such catastrophic quakes came from the middle of the continent, in a place with no towering fault scarp to warn of the danger, is exactly what makes this zone so unnerving. The danger is hidden, buried deep, and largely out of sight and out of mind for the millions who live above it. Memphis is especially vulnerable for several reasons. Much of the region sits on soft river valley soils, the loose, water-saturated sediments deposited by the Great River over thousands of years, and these soils can amplify shaking dramatically and are prone to that terrifying liquefaction that turns solid ground to liquid. Many of the buildings in the region were constructed long before modern earthquake awareness reached the area, in a place where people simply did not expect the ground to move. And because major earthquakes here are rare, occurring generations or centuries apart, the sense of danger has faded from public consciousness, even though the deep strain that caused those historic quakes has never gone away. Memphis is the reminder that fault line danger is not confined to the coasts, and that some of the most exposed places are the ones least prepared for what the ground beneath them could one day do. Hashtag number 5. Salt Lake City and the fault at the foot of the mountains. Now we travel west, to a great city cradled against a wall of mountains, a place of striking beauty that owes its very existence to the fault that threatens it. Salt Lake City, Utah, sits at the base of a towering mountain range, and running along that base, right where the mountains meet the valley floor, is a long and active fault. And here is the crucial and dangerous fact. The city did not grow at a safe distance from that fault. It grew directly along it, spreading across the very ground where the fault runs, so that the fault passes through populated parts of the metropolitan area. The mountains themselves are a monument to the fault's power. Over vast stretches of geological time, the fault has repeatedly lurched, dropping the valley down and pushing the mountains up, earthquake by earthquake, until the Great Range stood thousands of feet above the valley floor. Every one of those upward jumps was a major earthquake, and the fault has a long history of producing them at intervals that, in geological terms, place it well within the range where another could occur. The flat, fertile valley ground that made the city possible, and the dramatic mountain backdrop that makes it beautiful, are both the direct products of the fault that endangers it. The danger to Salt Lake City is compounded by what lies beneath it. Much of the valley is filled with soft sediments and, in places, the loose soils left behind by an ancient lake, exactly the kind of ground that amplifies shaking and is vulnerable to liquefaction. A significant portion of the region's older buildings were constructed of materials that fare poorly in earthquakes, and the population has grown enormously in the time since the last great rupture, meaning that far more people and property now sit in harm's way than ever before. When this fault finally moves in a major earthquake, the shaking would strike directly at a densely populated modern city built right on top of it, a city whose beauty and prosperity are inseparable from the very hazard that looms beneath it. Hashtag number 4. Seattle and the fault beneath the city. Next, we go to the Pacific Northwest, to a city famous for its coffee, its technology, and its rain, but far less known for the fault that runs directly beneath it. Seattle, Washington, sits above a fault that cuts roughly east to west through the region, passing beneath the city itself. This is separate from the great offshore subduction zone that also threatens the wider Pacific Northwest, and in some ways it is more directly menacing to the city, because it runs right through the populated heart of the area, rather than lying far out beneath the ocean. A fault running directly beneath a major city is a particularly alarming thing, because it means the source of the earthquake could be right underfoot, close and shallow, delivering intense shaking to the structures directly above it, with little warning and little distance to soften the blow. Scientists studying the region have found evidence that this fault has produced powerful earthquakes in the past, dramatic events that lifted portions of the landscape, sent waves across the local waters, and reshaped the shoreline. The fact that it has done so before means it can do so again, and the modern city that has grown above it would face the consequences. Seattle carries additional vulnerabilities that make the threat worse. Like several cities on this list, it contains large areas of soft, filled, and low-lying ground near the water, artificial land and soft soils that amplify shaking and are prone to liquefaction. The region sits in a deep basin that can trap and intensify seismic waves, prolonging and strengthening the shaking felt at the surface, and the city has grown dramatically, packing more people, more towers, and more critical infrastructure into the zone directly above the fault. When this fault beneath the city awakens, the earthquake would originate almost directly below one of the most important urban centers of the Pacific Northwest, striking it with the full and immediate force of a rupture that begins right at home. Hashtag number 3. The East Bay and the fault that splits it now. We return to California, but not to the city most people expect first. We go to the eastern side of the Great Bay, to the string of densely populated cities that sit directly astride one of the most dangerous urban faults in the entire country. This fault runs for a long distance through the heavily populated East Bay, threading directly through one city after another, passing beneath neighborhoods, roads, and public buildings, and even running straight through a famous stadium that has been visibly split and deformed by the slow, creeping movement of the ground. What makes this fault so uniquely dangerous is not only its history of powerful earthquakes, but its location. It runs directly through some of the most densely populated urban territory anywhere in the region, so that an enormous number of people live and work directly on top of it, or within the zone of the most intense shaking. When a fault runs beneath a wilderness, its rupture is a spectacle. When a fault runs beneath a chain of crowded cities, its rupture is a catastrophe. And this one is considered by many scientists to be among the most likely major faults in the region to produce a damaging earthquake, having built up strain over a long interval since it last let go in a great rupture. The surface danger here is especially vivid because the fault is not silent between earthquakes. In places it creeps, slowly and continuously deforming the ground above it, cracking curbs, offsetting walls, and bending structures built across the line, a constant visible reminder that the fault is alive and moving. That slow creep is a preview of the sudden, violent rupture that could one day come. And beneath much of the area lie the soft soils and filled ground near the bay that amplify shaking and threaten to liquefy. A major earthquake on this fault would tear directly through a chain of cities, exposing hundreds of thousands of people to surface rupture, violent shaking, and ground failure all at once. It is one of the most direct and dangerous examples in America of a great population built squarely on top of an active fault. Hashtag number 2. Los Angeles and the web of faults below now, we come to one of the largest urban regions in the entire country, a sprawling metropolis of millions that sits atop not just one fault, but a whole tangled web of them. Los Angeles is famous for earthquakes, but most people picture the Great Fault that runs through the region well to the north and east of the city center. What far fewer people realize is that the Los Angeles basin is riddled with additional faults, some of them running directly beneath the most heavily populated and developed parts of the city, and some of them of a particularly dangerous, hidden kind. Among the most alarming are the faults that do not reach the surface at all, the buried faults that lie concealed beneath the city, giving no visible sign of their presence until they rupture. One such hidden fault system is thought to run directly beneath the heart of the metropolitan area, and because it is buried. It went largely unrecognized for a long time, even as an enormous population built up directly above it. A rupture on a fault like this, positioned right under a dense urban core, could deliver devastating shaking to the very center of the city, striking millions of people and the towers, freeways, and infrastructure they depend on. Los Angeles compounds this danger with its geography. The city sits in a deep sedimentary basin, a great bowl of soft material that catches seismic waves, traps them, and amplifies them, so that the shaking in parts of the city can be far stronger and last far longer than it otherwise would. The region also contains extensive areas of older, vulnerable buildings, and its sheer size means that any major earthquake will find an enormous number of targets. When one of the faults beneath Los Angeles finally ruptures, whether the Great Fault to the northeast or one of the hidden faults directly below the city, the result would be one of the most consequential natural disasters in the nation's history, precisely because so many millions of people have built their lives directly on top of this restless, fractured ground. Hashtag number 1. San Francisco and the city on the Great Fault, and so we arrive at the top of our list, at the city whose very name is bound up with earthquakes, a place that has already been devastated once by the Great Fault it sits upon, and that remains one of the most dangerously positioned cities in the world. San Francisco sits on a narrow peninsula that is defined and shaped by the mighty fault running along and beneath it, one of the longest and most famous fault lines on Earth. This is the Great Boundary, where two vast plates of the planet's crust grind past each other, and the city is built right in its grip. San Francisco knows exactly what this fault can do, because it has felt it before. Long ago, a tremendous rupture on this fault unleashed a catastrophic earthquake that, together with the fires that followed, destroyed a huge portion of the city and became one of the defining disasters in the nation's history. That earthquake was caused by the very fault the city sits astride, and in the time since, the fault has been quietly rebuilding the strain that will one day be released again. The modern city, far larger, taller, and more crowded than the one that burned, now sits atop that reloading fault, waiting. The dangers here bring together everything we have discussed. There is the direct threat of surface rupture along the fault itself. There is the violent shaking that would radiate across the region. And there is the particular curse of San Francisco's ground, because much of the city's most valuable land is built on filled ground, on soft artificial soil created by dumping earth into the bay. Exactly the kind of ground that behaves catastrophically in an earthquake, losing its strength and flowing like a liquid so that buildings sink and topple. The neighborhoods built on that made ground suffered terribly in the past and would likely suffer again. San Francisco is the ultimate fault line city, a beautiful, iconic, densely populated metropolis built directly on one of the most powerful faults on the planet, a place living on borrowed time above a giant that has struck before and will inevitably strike again. Hashtag, when the ground finally moves it, is worth pausing to imagine what it would actually be like when one of these faults finally lets go beneath the city built upon it. Because the reality is unlike anything most people have ever experienced. For a city directly on top of a fault, there is almost no warning and almost no distance to soften the blow. The rupture begins right there, underfoot, and the energy arrives at the surface in an instant. One moment life is ordinary, and the next the ground itself is heaving, rolling, and lurching, throwing people off their feet, toppling furniture, shattering glass, and setting off a deafening chorus of alarms and breaking structures. In the worst hit zones, directly along the fault, the ground can literally split and shift, one side sliding past the other, tearing apart roads, pipelines, rail lines, and any building unlucky enough to straddle the line. Water mains rupture. Gas lines break, and, as history has shown time and again, the fires begin, sometimes doing more damage than the shaking itself, while firefighters struggle with hydrants left dry by the broken pipes. In areas of soft or filled ground, the earth can turn treacherous, buildings sinking and leaning as the soil loses its strength. And the shaking, in a great earthquake, does not last for a few brief seconds, but can roll on for a punishing stretch of time, long enough to bring down structures that survived the first jolt. Then comes the aftermath, which for a city built on a fault can be as dangerous as the earthquake itself. The very infrastructure that a modern city depends on, its water, its power, its roads, its bridges, its communications, can be crippled all at once, precisely when it is needed most. Help may struggle to reach the hardest hit areas because the routes into them are broken. Aftershocks continue to rattle already weakened buildings, and the residents, many of whom never truly believed the day would come, are left to grapple with a transformed and broken landscape, often for a long time, as the slow work of recovery and rebuilding begins. This is the reckoning that waits beneath each of these cities, not as a distant fantasy, but as a geological certainty. The faults have ruptured before, and they will rupture again. The only uncertainty is the timing and whether the people living above them will have prepared for the day the ground beneath their feet finally decides to move. Hashtag living on the restless ground 6 cities, spread across the country, from the coast of California to the mountains of Utah to the banks of the Mississippi, all built directly on top of active fault lines. When you line them up, a sobering picture emerges. These are not obscure remote outposts. They are major centers of population, culture, technology, and commerce. Home to many millions of people who, for the most part, go about their daily lives without a second thought for the seams in the earth beneath them. The ground feels solid, the buildings feel permanent. And yet, under all of it, the strain keeps building, silently, patiently, toward the day the fault finally moves. What ties these cities together is a strange and very human story. In almost every case, the fault is not just a hazard the city happens to sit near. It is part of the reason the city exists at all. The faults carved the bays that made the harbors, raised the mountains that gathered the water, and flattened the valleys that offered easy ground to build on. People were drawn to these places by the very landscapes the faults created, and in settling there, they placed themselves directly in the path of the danger. It is a bargain struck, often unknowingly, all across the seismic regions of the country, beauty and opportunity in exchange for the ever-present risk of the ground tearing apart. But knowledge is power, and understanding this danger is the first and most important step toward surviving it. These cities are not doomed. Modern engineering has made enormous strides in building structures that can withstand violent shaking, in strengthening the older buildings most likely to fail, and in designing critical infrastructure to bend and flex rather than break. Preparation, awareness, and smart building can dramatically reduce the toll when the earthquake finally comes. The people who live on these restless grounds can choose to respect the danger, to prepare their homes and their families, and to support the ongoing work of making their cities more resilient. The faults will move again. That much is certain, written into the very rock beneath these cities. The only question that remains is whether the millions who live above them will be ready when the day arrives, or whether they will be caught, like so many before them, unprepared upon the trembling ground.